All right, with module 23, we're talking about endpoint vulnerability assessment. So we talked last time about how to go through and protect. Now we're going to go through and do an assessment of the vulnerabilities on the endpoint. So to do this, the module objectives is going to be finding out what network and server profiling, so finding out a value of the network. We're going to find out the CVSS, which are pretty common. These are CVSS reports used to describe security vulnerabilities. These are common scoring vulnerabilities. You have secure device management, or SDM. This is going to explain how to do these techniques, as well as used to protect data and assets. And then information security management systems. This is going to be to protect the assets itself. So with network and server profiling, again, it's good to always get a baseline of information so that you have something to serve as a reference point when you're trying to detect anomalies. So pieces of a network profile are going to be a session duration, total throughput, critical asset address space, and typical traffic type. So what does this mean? This means, what is the average time between the establishment of a data flow and its termination? And then when we're looking at throughput, what's the average amount of data passing from a given source to a given destination in a given period of time? And then if we look at their critical asset address space, what's the IP address space of this critical asset owned by us, the organization? And then the ports used, what is the acceptable list of TCP and UDP processes that are available to accept data? So a lot of times people will forget the network monitoring side of setting up a network. And it's extremely important because if you don't have a baseline of anything, and by a baseline, this can be simply just monitoring the network and doing things like net flow and things like that, where you can get an idea of the type of traffic that goes across your network. And if you notice that, most of the network traffic flowing across here is web traffic, or maybe it's other types of traffic, depending on your network. If you suddenly see a large spike in other types of traffic that shouldn't be there, then you have that anomaly. And you can compare that. You can set alerts, you can set high thresholds, etc. But you got to have that baseline in order to detect those anomalies well. So for server profiling, this is going to be a security baseline for the server itself. And this is used to establish an accepted operating state of the server. So the things that you're going to look for in this profile is getting a set of listening ports, what ports are open, what users are logged in their accounts, what times they're getting logged in, etc. So if Jim only works from 9 o'clock at night till 3 in the morning, and he's suddenly logging in at noon, then that would be detection of an anomaly. He shouldn't be here. That's not his normal shift. Service accounts on the system itself, as well as making sure that the software is up to date. So examples of a network anomaly detection is going to be described by large amounts of diverse data, such as features of a packet flow, features of the packets themselves, or telemetry from multiple sources. Big data analytics is huge now in order to use and technique, or big data techniques are used to analyze this data and detect variations from the baseline, because you're dealing with a large volume of data. The anomaly detection can identify infected hosts on a network that are scanning for other vulnerable hosts. And this figure here will kind of illustrate a simplified version of an algorithm designed to detect an unusual condition at the border routers of an enterprise. So for example, on the border routers, we're checking every minute that we're looking at counting flows and sampling one out of every so many during Z seconds. If the number of flows is greater than N, then we do yes, we throw an alarm. If no, then we end. And this was kind of referring back to that net flow I was talking about. So if we're seeing an abnormally large amount of traffic come through that we wouldn't normally anticipate or predict, then as we're sampling through that, we're going to throw an alarm out on our system. To do network vulnerability testing, this is going to include risk analysis, vulnerability assessment, and penetration testing. Below is some of these activities and tools that you will use. So for risk analysis, this is typically done by internal or external consultants, risk management frameworks, etc. This is usually a comprehensive analysis of those impact of those attacks, primarily as to what would it do with the business. So this is very business oriented on the risk analysis. For the vulnerability assessment here, this is more technical. This is going to deal with patch management, host scans, port scanning, and other vulnerability scans and services. Tools that you guys would use would be things like OpenVAS, Nessus, Qualys, and Mmap. Microsoft Baseline Analyzer is great for servers in order to get a baseline of what ports are open, etc., that you can then go through and analyze against. If you're doing penetration testing, again, this is using hacking techniques and tools in order to penetrate network defenses and identify those depth of potential penetration. So here you're going to be doing a business risk analysis. This vulnerability is just doing a light scan. You're not actually attacking anything or anything like that. You're just getting a list of vulnerabilities. And on the actual penetration testing, you're actually going to use these tools. And some of the more common ones out there are going to be Metasploit. You have Core Impact. So Metasploit is generally free, the base version. They now have a subscribe program that you can get to. And Core Impact is a significantly expensive machine, but it is like click and hack type systems. You definitely don't want your attackers to have something like Core Impact. So to identify risk, we work with our common vulnerability scoring system, so CVSS. The way this works is it's a risk assessment tool used to convey the common attributes and severity of vulnerabilities inside a computer hardware and software system. So it's a standardized vulnerability score. It provides an open framework for all metrics to all users. It helps prioritize risk. And then the forum, or the first, in this case, they define it as the forum of incident response and security teams, has been designated as the custodian of CVSS in order to promote adoption globally. So generally in the security world, when you find a vulnerability, it's going to have a CVSS score. And so CVSS uses three groups of metrics. You have the base metric group over here on the left-hand side. This is going to represent the characteristics of the vulnerability that are constant over time across contexts. Then you have the temporal metric group. This is going to be characteristics that change over time, but not necessarily cross over into the user environment. And then the user or environment metric group is going to be aspects of the vulnerability that are rooted to a specific organization's environment. So with that base group, you're going to have things like attack vector, the attack complexity, the privileges that are required, user interaction, and scope. And so these are all things that are defined over here. You could also have the impact metrics, which are the confidentiality impact, integrity impact, and the availability. So how does this work? There's a CVSS process, uses a tool called the version 3.1 calculator. This calculator is like a questionnaire in which the choices are made to describe the vulnerability for each metric. Later, a score is generated and this numeric severity reading is ended up being displayed. So after a base metric group is completed, the temporal and environmental metric values modify the base metric results in order to provide an overall score. So again, you start with this base, you get a base score, you then tag in your temp formula or whatever this temp metric group is, adjust it temporarily, and then bring it over here for the environmentally adjust score as well. So how do these ratings work? Well, the higher the severity rating, the greater the potential impact of an exploit or greater the urgency in addressing the vulnerabilities. Any vulnerability that exceeds 3.9 should be addressed. So that's what's defined as a low vulnerability. The ranges of those scores and the corresponding qualitative meaning is shown here. So if you see anything above a 3.9 when you're doing your vulnerability assessments, that's something that you should try to take care of. Below that, it could be fairly benign. Most things are going to have some kind of security threat. Even having a user on a system is a security threat, right? I mean, it's just it's a port for people to get into. Even if it's the most secure password, et cetera, whatever, it's still a threat. And therefore, it's going to have a lower CVSS score. So common vulnerabilities and exposures, these are going to be your CVEs. These go along with your CVSS. These are going to be identifiers that provide a standard way to research and reference vulnerabilities. So of the vulnerabilities that are out there, everything gets an identifier. As you can see here, this is CVE 2020-13442. These threat intelligence services like CVIE identifiers, they all appear in various security system logs. And then you have the main CVE website that's going to provide the linkage between the CVSS scores and the CVE information. You also have the National Vulnerability Database, or NVD. This is going to utilize those CVE identifiers and supplies additional information about that vulnerability, such as the CVSS threat scores, technical details, some affected entities, and the resources for further investigation. So the database was created and maintained by the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST agency. So to cure device management, so again, we talked about risk management and risk assessment. This is going to involve the selection and specification of security controls for an organization. The mandatory activity is doing this risk assessment in order to identify threats and vulnerabilities. There's main ways to identify this risk. So you have risk avoidance, which is to stop performing the activities that created the risk. You have risk reduction in order to take measures and reduce vulnerability. Risk sharing is going to be shift some of that risk to other parties. And then risk retention is accept that risk and its consequences that come out. So when you're weighing all of these out, you're going to find different ways to do this. There may be ways of like risk sharing, which means you may be hiring a security organization and therefore they're responsible for that risk. There's all sorts of ways to mitigate this. So vulnerability management is going to be a security practice that's designed to proactively prevent the exploitation of IT vulnerabilities. To do this, you have a little process. So you have discover, in which you develop a network baseline, identify those security vulnerabilities on a regular automated schedule. You have prioritize assets, or categorize your assets into groups or business units and assign a business value based on their criticality to the business operations. So again, this is very business driven on this side of the cybersecurity. It's not the technical side. What you're really looking at is the business side. In other words, if we lose this web server, are we a web server company and will our business go down? Can we use backups? Can we fire up another web server at another location, et cetera? Those are going to be your assets that you want to take care of. And then you can go through and assess, take this baseline security risk profile, eliminate as many of the risks that you can based on criticality, vulnerability, threats, and then their asset classification. From there, you're going to build a report, which is going to measure your level of business risk associated with your assets according to your security policies. This should be a documented security plan, monitor suspicious activity, and then describe known vulnerabilities in here. In the event that you do have an attack, you have remediation. This is going to prioritize according to business risk and address vulnerabilities in a order of the risk. So if you have minimal vulnerabilities, you want to make sure you take care of the high priority ones first. Last, you'll verify the threats have been eliminated through follow-up audits. This means you're going to go pretty much through that discover again after you've done remediation to make sure that those have actually been taken care of. So for asset management, this is going to be the implementation of systems that track the location and configuration of network-defined devices, as well as software across the enterprise itself. There's automated discovery tools and inventory of actual stated devices. There's articulation of desired states for those devices using policies, plans, and procedures within the organization's information security plan. Identification of a non-compliant authorized asset or remediation or acceptance of this device state is possible with an iteration of the desired state definition. Repeat that process or regular ongoing interviews. So for mobile devices, they physically cannot be controlled on the premises by the organization, which is why you'll use mobile device software for both Android and iOS. You'll tend to have things like MDM systems, such as Cisco's Meraki Systems Manager, in which the security personnel will configure, monitor, and update a very diverse set of mobile clients from within the cloud. For configuration management, this is going to be as defined by NIST, and the configuration management is comprises of a collection of activities focused on establishing and maintaining the integrity of products and systems through the control of the process of initializing, changing, and monitoring those configurations of those products and systems. And so different things that we use for configuration, we have Puppet, Chef, Ansible, and SaltStack. These are using various coding languages. Ones that are common now is going to be Puppet and Chef. Ansible, for those of you that took my Python course, Ansible is a big one that's written in Python. But Puppet and Chef are nice. So what these do is this allows you to configure devices and do them all together. So you have a centralized management. Instead of logging into a bunch of different routers and switches and PCs, you can click one button and it goes out and configures all these different systems. You can also spin up new systems and have them automatically configured to your tailors. So I've used this to spin up virtual machines and then configure those virtual machines based on a unique set of specifications. And then Puppet, Chef, and Ansible will take care of that. You also have patch management, and it's extremely important to have a patch management routine. It's going to involve all the aspects of software patching, including identifying required patches, acquiring, distributing, installing, and verifying. Different patch management is required by some compliance regulations, such as Sarbanes-Oxley and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or your HIPAA. So you could have agent-based ones. This is going to require a software agent be running on each of the hosts to be patched. The agent reports whether the vulnerable software is installed on the system, and then the agent communicates with the patch management server and determines if that patch exists and requires installation, and then installs that patch. So agent-based approaches in this are preferred means of patching mobile devices. This is pretty common today if you think of it as a basic level of Windows updates. Those generally come out Tuesday. It checks for updates. If they're mandatory updates, it goes ahead and automatically installs them if you have it set to do so. But in terms of getting those, if you're on an enterprise network, you will download all those updates and patches to a centralized server and then pull from there versus trying to pull out from the internet. You can also have agentless scanning, in which a patch management server is going to scan the network for devices that require patching. The server will determine which of these patches are required and install those on the clients. Only devices that are on the scan network segments can be patched, which makes a problem for mobile devices. So again, agent-based means that if you're a remote system, you will phone home to look for patches and then bring that information down, where on a patch management system, everything is pushed out. You also have passive network monitoring. These are going to be devices that require patching and are identified through monitoring of traffic on the network. This approach is only effective for software that includes version information in its network traffic. So if you're looking at a web server or something like that, and you know which web server you're running, for example, Nginx, that information is actually passed within the network traffic, and therefore we can determine whether or not it needs to be updated. For information security management systems, this is going to be your ISMS, and it's going to consist of your management framework to identify, analyze, and address information security risks. These provide conceptual models that guide organizations into planning, implementing, governing, and evaluating information security programs. It incorporates a plan, do, check, act framework known as the deeming cycle. The ISM is going to be seen as the elaboration on process or people, process, technology, culture model of organizational compatibility. So you can see those two models that are typically used out here. In the Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is a ISO IEC 2700 or the 2701, is a standard that's internationally accepted to facilitate business conducted between countries. The specific 27001 is the global industry-wide specification for an ISMS. And so the idea here is that you have a Plan, Do, Check, Act process. You'll go through each one of these sections individually, and as long as everybody does this globally, then they can make sure they're on the same standard. You also have what is called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is going to be a set of standards designed to integrate existing standards, guidelines, and practices to help better manage and reduce cybersecurity risk. The following table below defines the core functions of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So you will identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And many organizations these days are having to go through NIST cybersecurity frameworks. This framework is very huge to read through. There's actually quite a bit of documents that you would do in my firewalls class to read through some of the NIST documents. But everybody is responsible for their different NIST framework, and getting approved by that is a long and heartache process, and it's also a continual process. So I know of some ISPs that have had to go through this process, as well as some larger corporations and organizations. So to summarize, endpoint vulnerability assessment, again, this is, if you look at this, you have an assessment that is not necessarily technical. So being a cybersecurity analyst isn't just being a technical person that knows ports and knows how traffic goes through, et cetera. They really need to understand the business practice and the business motto, or what is their goal, the business goals, so that you can understand what their risk factors are going to be. And so to do this vulnerability assessment, we have to have network and device profiling for statistical baselines to serve as a reference point. We're also going to need to have network security evaluated by a security or a variety of tools and services. We're going to use a vulnerability assessment, which is going to scan the internet-facing servers and internal networks for various types of vulnerabilities. That assessment is going to return us what is called a common vulnerability scoring system, or a CVSS score. This is a vendor-neutral, industry standard open framework for rating those risks and given a vulnerability, as well as the variety of metrics used to calculate that particular score. Those vulnerabilities are then rated based on attack vector, attack complexity, privileges required, user interaction, and scope. And with that, it's going to involve the selection and specification of those security controls for an organization. When you run through these, you're going to have something like an information security management system, or ISMS, to identify, analyze, and address those security risks. There are standards for cybersecurity risk, which are available from ISO and NIST. Remember, the NIST cybersecurity framework is similar to that ISO 27001. However, the NIST cybersecurity framework is very, very popular today. It's a standard you should be familiar with. All right, that concludes this particular module.